Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion on Air podcast. This podcast is a program of the American Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges Diversity Matters Initiative. The podcast explores various issues related to diversity and inclusion in the veterinary profession and provides the AAVMC an opportunity to offer ongoing diversity programming to our member institutions as well as all veterinary professionals. My name is Dr. Lisa Greenhill, and I am the Chief Diversity Officer here at the AAVMC. And as we are in the last week of Black History Month, happy Black History Month for everybody that observes, yay, yay. We'll be doing some really cool things for Women's History Month next month, so be sure to stay tuned. On this episode of the pod, we're exploring what it means to be a first-generation college attendee. So just under 1 in 3 veterinary students and veterinary faculty identify as first gen. And I'm not going to define it now because that's the whole point of our conversation. But I think that we used to clearly understand, kind of have a good understanding of what it meant to be a first generation college attendee, right? But the reality is that lots of different identities, most of which are marginalized, and communities it really have similar or even identical experiences to what we consider the kind of the classical ideal around first gen students. And so much so, there's been so much change in this space that some institutions and organizations, AAVMC included, are considering creating a new, more expansive, inclusive definition to really kind of describe more of the experience rather than the people having the experience, right? So my guest today works with this first gen population on a day-to-day basis and really just stepped into an amazing new role that really kind of centers this experience. And not only that, is a very special guest to me, as I met Jen more than just a few years ago, 2 decades, when I was working at a professional nursing organization and they were still in undergrad, I believe, right? So welcome to AAVMC's Diversity and Inclusion on Air, Jenifer Berry. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. It's really good to be here. And I mean, how cool is this? Like, I don't think either of us could have pictured this moment a couple decades ago.
Right.
But it's great. It's great to have this conversation with you. And I'm glad that we've stayed connected over the years. And so officially, my name is Jen Berry, and I am the inaugural university director for first generation and low or limited income student support at Indiana University.
Awesome. So now that we've got those introductions out of the way, let's dive in. So, Jen, how have we classically kind of historically thought about or defined the first gen student slash experience? What
Right.
is
So even though it's kind of been a complex definition, it's also just kind of hovered in the same area as you kind of alluded to in your intro, which is focused on who in one's family has or hasn't attended college, and then talking about broadening. So what kind of college, right? Who in the family, right? And I think really thinking about like you said, the experience of the student, maybe not so much their relationship to a college graduate. Now, I'm not saying that their relationship to a college graduate is not important, because it is, right? And that's why we're focusing in on this, is that, folks are acknowledging and recognizing that students who may be the first in their family to attend college, however we're defining in that moment, are having a particular set of experiences that students who are not typically don't. And what do those experiences yield as far as outcomes? And because we're paying attention to this, it says that we're not satisfied with those outcomes, right? And so we're really thinking about, and I think it's great that we're thinking about things in this way. How can we better define this priority population so that we can then support this priority population, right? And I just think it's so important that we're doing this across society.
Yeah, yeah. So typically we've always kind of thought about first gen. I am a first gen student. I was a first gen student. My parents did some community college, some undergrad, but didn't complete there. So, but there was some experience there. But not in, I mean, it was nothing like the experience I ended up having as a first gen student, right? And so there I was, and even kind of just thinking about prepping to apply, right? My parents were really invested, and they kind of, met this ideal of kind of maybe what it might look like for a family to traipse up to the school, and they're sitting in the little information session. My family was kind of, special because my dad brought the tape recorder, which was kind of embarrassing, but helpful.
Right.
It
In
was
the end,
helpful. I was like, we could
right.
have just taken notes, but helpful. And so my sisters had a slightly different experience because I was the first, right? And so they kind of had a little bit more understanding of what to expect, but also still first gen students, right? But now uh, it looks really different, and I'm very very open about the fact that I'm an adoptive parent. My daughter was older at the time of adoption, and she was 12, so a preteen. And so I'm like, okay, when I adopted her I was finishing up my doctorate. Okay, so on paper my daughter is not first gen, but she had spent, the first huge part of her life in a family that did not include parents that went to any type of higher ed, right? And so when she got to college, despite all of my best efforts, she really struggled, and she struggled in ways that were very very similar to what we would consider a traditional kind of first gen experience, right? And despite everything, I was throwing everything at the wall trying to smooth her path, but it was her path and not mine.
Right.
So, how do we kind of think about this definition around kind of what it means? Because again, on paper, she wasn't eligible for any of those kinds of programs that targeted that type of student.
Right. And I think that's it's not a completely unique experience, right? Especially when you think about if we are going to be very specific. So we're talking about broadening the definition, but also maybe narrowing in some ways, right? So if we're saying, neither biological parent, right, or guardian, or if we're saying, your grandparents went to college, but that didn't, what was that impact, right? So as we think about those things and we think about what is different in the experience between a student whose grandparents went to college, but their parents didn't, why is there a potentially different experience there? And we think about, look, the sociologist in me, socialization, and thinking about our biggest socializing agents, right? The first one is our parents in our
Yeah.
home, the folks that we're with, in some very forming and developmentally important times in our lives, right? If we think about the education, that foundation that's laid for us in primary education, that can kind of steer us in some different ways to where we end up in high school and or beyond. And so if that foundation is given to us by parents who are absolutely doing the best that they can, but what's in their toolkit is a different set of tools that's in there than a family who is giving their kindergartner um, these experiences based on what they know about the world and how broadly they're thinking comparatively, then that's going to change the experience of each of those students, right? And
Yeah.
so, regardless, like you said, with your daughter, so regardless of um, when you all established your relationship and became a family, some foundations had already
Yeah.
been laid, and those were things that she carried with her, whether or not she knew it, you knew it, or we expected that to happen, right? And I think that's interesting and important because even when we consider step parents, right, which,
Yeah.
I've talked about, this is somewhat of my experience, right? So, my kids are technically like step kids.
Yeah.
And although we the formative years of their lives, I was in graduate school, right? They grew up on a college campus, right? In and out, and just had the having as giving them as much social capital as I could, in cultural capital. And but still, my daughter in particularly having an experience that reflected a very quote unquote first gen, if we want to be typical, experience. And so even with a parent who worked at the institution she was attending, worked for the scholarship program that she was a part of, and was giving her things, there still was some challenge there, right? And that's because there are some things that she had held on to based on her experiences that impacted how she moved on a college campus, how she asked for help or didn't, how she was resource aware or wasn't, how she used networks or didn't, and so we have to think about, like, sometimes you just don't even know that you're not doing the things that you should be doing or could be doing to change or impact your experience, right? And so I think that's a lot of what we have to think about is, what are the experiences that students are having, and who are the students that are having those experiences, and how do we support them so that they can have different experiences?
Yeah, yeah. So you've alluded to a couple of kind of some concrete examples, and certainly we talked about one before the show started in pre-production, where it was like, "Oh, you had office hours today," and then
Yep.
basically your free time, right? Because
Right,
they
right.
don't come by, right? And this is in your role, like, and like, and so people know that you're there, but what are some other kind of those unique kind of examples and challenges that this kind of broad first gen population has?
Right. So office hour is a big one. And what's interesting is that the class that I'm teaching is actually a sociology of education based course. It's called Education and Society. And I'm teaching the class like you would, but I'm also really interested in my pedagogical approaches along the way. So I even had a moment with the class where I talked about office hours. Now, most of them are juniors and seniors, and so they are aware of office hours, right? But trying to break down that hidden curriculum a bit more for them very directly, and saying, like, maybe you have questions about class and maybe you don't. Maybe you just want to come by and you want to know what kind of music I'm listening to. And then that's how relationships begin. And then you get letters from folks, and you get advice from folks, and you get um, support from folks that are not necessarily only a staff member or just faculty, right? I have a very interesting role at the university, wear lots of different hats. So office hours, right? So students often think that it's just if I'm having a problem, not understanding something, but it's so much more beyond that. The social cultural capital exchange that happens in an office hour is almost unquantifiable, right? So you can't really illuminate all of the benefits of it, right?
Yeah.
So another is, I would say, maybe asking for help, right? And that speaks to a lot of really interesting things, right? So if you're the first to do anything, particularly the first in your family or in a community, that's a lot of pressure,
Yeah.
right? So we know that college students put pressure on themselves, period. But when you've got these compounding layers of pressure on top of you, and this expectation of, like, well, you got to college, right? So we know you can handle it. We know you got this, right? And it's like, okay, but maybe I don't. And, like, I need to ask some questions. But if I ask questions, I'm revealing weakness. And
Right.
I'm letting folks know that maybe I don't really belong here. I'm already dealing with that imposter within, right? And so I'm gonna figure it out on my own because like everybody said, I got this, right? And meanwhile, like this is where there is a huge disconnect with us as higher ed professionals and students, is that we're out here with tons of resources, right? And wanting to connect them to the resources. And if we bridge that gap there would have to be less of this negotiation of students around should I ask, can I ask, who can I ask, what can I do, right? So thinking about the best ways to hit students' focus and attention, right? Because it can be really hard, especially like, where I was working at Bloomington, um, you know, traditional age residential campus within Indiana University. And we're talking about students in a particular developmental space. And so, how do we capture them and their attention, given where they are in their ability and development, and the urgency of us getting these things to them, right? So, resources exist, but getting students to tap into them is another area where we see some weaker connection.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I just recall and have seen so many students over my career who have that imposter syndrome. And it's very hard to kind of break it, right? We talk a lot about it in our kind of professional lives and those types of things, right? Especially kind of ascending to leadership and those types of things. And we don't necessarily always think about it as the college freshman who made good, right? Like they made good, they got out of whatever background they might have been coming from. That background could be the inner city, that background could be Appalachia. Like it
Right,
doesn't really
right,
matter, right?
right,
But they don't have, there's not a clear, the path for them doesn't appear clear. Like it's not even that there's a path, like there's just something there and now they're in it.
yep, yep,
And even though there's all of these resources, as you said, it's just like if I avail myself of those resources, then people will know I need help, even though those resources are there because we recognize that you need help.
right, right.
Right. So there's also, I mean, so there's this imposter syndrome, but there's also this pride too,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
Because when you're coming from some of these backgrounds, not all of them, but some of them, like there's a lot of like pride there that you kind of have to bust through, only to find the shame.
Yeah, right, exactly.
You bust through the pride only to find the shame there about have feeling like, wow, I did the scores, I did the SAT, I got here. And that's just for undergrad. Like suppose they make it through undergrad and we'll talk a little bit about what this, thinking about this at higher levels of higher ed, graduate and professional work. But it's really incredibly, it requires an admission of that vulnerability. And frankly, that's hard for everyone, right?
It
That's
is.
hard for everyone. And so when we think about this definition, and all of these different experiences, and there's someone in the chat that brought up like, well, what about immigrant families, first or
Yes,
second
yes.
generation students, and we'll be doing a show on that later this spring as well, just getting at this particular issue, right? Yeah, okay, they're coming over. They oftentimes don't just have one degree, they might have several,
Right,
right?
right,
Um,
right.
and yet it's a completely different system,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
completely different system and a
mm-hmm.
completely, I mean, and potentially a different language and different systems and all of these things. And so as we think about how might we define it, as the professional, what might that look like? Hint hint,
Right,
language.
right, right. So, and I've been thinking about this for some time, like what could be some other ways to um capture this without like a really, really long
Right,
title, right? So that
like
because we want
diversity
to
definitions
exactly, right?
for
Because we
this
do want to
discussion.
be inclusive, right? And we don't want folks to either say, "Oh, that's not me," because they don't see it in the taglines, right?
Yeah.
Or to feel like they're not being seen, right? Because navigating while parents who have different countries of origin um, have lots of cultural capital because they navigated the
Mhm.
system there. They don't have American or United States cultural capital, right? And so that's where that gap is. And so that's where it's important to recognize these students and say, like, hey, well, what's their experience? And we can't just say maybe their experience is like an international student's experience. We can't just kind of lump
That's
folks
really
together.
fair.
Right. Because international students have a whole other set of experiences, right? And how they navigate this curriculum. And so we do have to really, I think, be intentional about who who we're seeing that needs the help. Meaning, when we look at our numbers, right? So in my notes, I wrote, we have to gather and assess data. That's huge. And I know institutions do lots of this and we have lots of it everywhere, but we have to be asking the right questions. And yet we have to really be intentional about getting answers from students who wouldn't normally answer so that we can serve those students, right? So thinking about what partnerships exist on campus, like what scholarship programs and things can you work with, who can access those students so you can get those voices. But once you capture who it is that needs the most support, I think that's when the definition can come into play. And I do think it's important for there to be some kind of a standard amongst institutions, I think a general base of similarity. Um, but I think it's also important for each institution to kind of define for themselves, right? So if we're talking about, like you mentioned, Appalachia, right? So that we may have a large number, a huge rural population that is matriculating to this institution, and their needs are going to be different than those who are from suburbia. And so we have to think about, well, what are the behaviors or patterns, or I don't want to say deficits because that just sounds kind of, but the gaps, the opportunities that we see with those students, and then how can we communicate that so those students recognize that what we have here is for them?
Yeah. So, you're not giving me a lot of hope on this definition, Jen. Like that's a
No,
process. I was hoping for a magic like,
no,
response that I can be like, I did this
sorry.
podcast and like check the box. I have a working group. Like, go watch this. But of course, it's not that easy. Um, well, so thinking about it, I guess from a different perspective, do you think that the lingo maybe needs
Mm,
to change, right? And so, should we be actually continuing to use even just this terminology of first gen when we've kind of evolved past this, two parent like situation. They stay, they raise their kids, da, 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 da. Like the world doesn't, I mean, there's parts of the world that look like that. There's parts of our world that look like that. My parents are still, two parents, blah, blah, blah. They did the thing, right? But that's not my experience with my daughter one
right,
generation later. And I have a sister that's like she has a blended family as well. And so, so is it maybe that the language needs to change to actually maybe capture what these experiences are? Should we be asking things like, rate your help seeking behaviors or something like that?
right. You asked really, really tough but good questions, Lisa. Okay, so uh, I think I'm going to go back to the data, right? So I think um, like you just said, right? It's about what questions we're asking for our particular population at our institution, um, because that's what matters most, right? So we can't really get kind of caught up in this too broad, like
Yeah,
not
yeah,
broad, wide, but
yeah,
across,
right across.
um, because I'm in Indiana, right? And I know you all have institutions all over, right? But I learned a whole lot about a lot of different things out here in Indiana as far as students who come from very small places and they're like, there's one stop light. And I'm like, really?
Mm,
And right. So those kinds of differences. And so thinking about what our needs are at our institution, right? So if you have a high number of maybe military veterans, right? So being very specific. And I think that that's the kind of intentionality our students deserve at this point, right? The face of higher education is changing. These institutions weren't necessarily built for lots of the folks who are in them. And, when we talk about the culture of college, the culture of an institution or college, higher education in general, whose culture, right, is that? And how do we, where are we in defining and kind of how we're determining value about culture, right? And so that's when it gets to policies and practices and thinking about it may not just be about how we identify or how we label or group together folks, but who are we as an institution and how do we provide for our students,
mm,
right? And so I think, I do think it's important to have language that is affirming. But I'm really over the past 6 weeks in my new position, I have
uh,
really been seeing things very differently and understanding things very differently and just kind of thinking about, what does it really mean to be student ready, right? Which is a change in language from being college students being college ready, right? That puts the responsibility on us as the higher education professionals and not on the students who are coming to get things from us as the professionals, including faculty, right? So thinking about how we put those things together and target who our students are and support who our students are. And I think maybe some, like, people don't like to work this way, but maybe the language will come from that.
yeah. So I just put in the chat a little bit of a kind of for me a mic drop, but are we student ready? Right? We do ask, and you're right, there is an inherent kind of burden. Are you college ready? And like I had the grades, I had the courses. I didn't really have much else. Like, right. And so kind of flipping that and making us think about, are we as an institution, as an organization, student ready? Are we prepared to actually educate everyone that kind of comes to the door? And you're right, and we talk about this a lot, that these systems, like, I cut to the chase on this show. Like, they were not built for folks that look like you and me. They were not built for a lot of folks that are moving through the doors, right? And so we don't want people to feel like they have to assimilate to be there, right? But we do want to skill build in terms of becoming, understanding problem solving is in part about, help seeking behaviors and being able to know where to look for information and all of these different kinds of things that I think a lot of us as educators evolve to take for granted, that folks just know, especially in the current environment when technology abounds. Well, why can't you just look it up? And, but we've got misinformation, we've got disinformation. How do you sift through it if, yeah, you got great grades, but are you media literate?
Exactly, exactly, right. That's a whole other conversation about the existence of technology versus one's ability to use technology effectively or efficiently.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily coincide,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. So we have
Um,
another question in the chat about children of refugees, which is an increasing challenge globally. whose parents might have been in school and then they couldn't continue their studies. And, again, you kind of pivot on that Maslow's hierarchy. Well, it's not even a pivot. You drop to the
Right.
bottom, right?
Yep.
Where you're just kind of figuring out how to get basic needs met.
Mhm.
And now they are here or in whatever country, frankly, they are allowed to enter.
Right.
And then what, right? They get those kids in school and they're having, this experience as well. Yeah.
Right. So again, another important priority population that we have to consider. And again, as the face of higher education changes, if we are being mindful of that, and if we are here to do the work that most of us are here to do, which is to help students um, grow and develop and learn in whatever arena, then we would be one acknowledging that their experience impacts how they show up and if they show up in
Mhm.
higher education. And so when we have them here, what resources and supports do we have for them, but not just them alone? And this is something else along with like first gen students and or low limited income students is bringing the family in, right? So, which is like completely different than what you think of when you think of college, right? And I remember when I first became a higher ed professional as an academic advisor, I am guilty. I'll be honest and say in front of everybody that I would say to students like you left home, you need to just invest all of yourself in this space. You need to let go of your family. I mean, it was just like, and so then years later, after I thought about it a little bit and learned and grew as an individual and a professional, I was like, oh man, you really said that to excuse me, students, you really said that to them? Like you should reevaluate that. And I did. So it was humbling, but I had to really think about, wow, that was part of my experience. That was part of what my family did in a way of support, which was even though I was in the same city that I grew up in, I was over there and I was doing everything that I needed to do. And if I needed something, I'd break out of the bubble. But they let me have that. But other communities don't have, that's not how they function. They function together. And so I realized that there were a lot of students I said that to, and I almost wanted to go back and apologize to them because I was like, wow, that was my ignorance.
Yeah.
And so that's where we have to really consider what can we do to support the family, to support the community. Institutions have to go into communities now, right? And be visible.
Yeah.
Because the world, these students and these people in these untouched places, well, they deserve opportunity for
Absolutely.
education as well. And we have resources and we have space. And so we should be differently intentional about that. And of course, we're all waiting for or moving through the enrollment cliff and or
Yeah.
shift,
Yeah.
right? And so thinking about who will be matriculating to college as that changes over the next few years, their needs are going to change. And so our roles are going to change. And so we can become frustrated with outcomes, right? So graduation rates and retention rates, if we don't do anything to prepare. But if we do and we recognize how things are shifting and changing, um, even if it's the culture of our institution is becoming different and looking different, we have to adapt to that so that we can not have those dips. Because each dip, each number is a student and their experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Such important points. One, I think that oftentimes when we've been through it and we have a few years removed from it,
Mhm.
just a couple, we forget the privilege of that experience, right? And we forget. So it's really easy for folks, higher ed professionals, as well as parents, because I was really hard on my daughter until I had this revelation of what her experience actually was, right? Now, on the one hand, she had a great time her first year of college. Her grades did not reflect the great time that she had at college because she wasn't going to class. But that's a whole like, right. But I'm thinking through and thinking through this, and I was just like, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you going there? Have you gone to office hours? Have you done this? Have you done that? Da, 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 da. And I'm like, and I look back now and like you, I'm like, I am so horrified. I had just finished a whole doctorate in higher education, and I expected my daughter to behave in a way that she had not previously ever behaved before. Right. And it's kind of like the flip side of, you're doing something the same way over and over and over again is the definition of, right, some form of air quote insanity. I'm like, I was going through a version of this where I was like, I had these expectations, and then it dawned on me one day that she was having a very different experience, and I had to meet her where she was. So I forgot about that in my own privilege of working in higher ed, doing all these degrees, all of this stuff, and I'm like, this is going to be a breeze. Terrible.
Yeah.
So shout out Leandra. I'm sorry, but there's your public apology. But we forget about those kinds of realities. The other thing that I think folks are not, I mean, certainly we talk about the enrollment cliff, but we also don't necessarily talk enough about the shift from just the ideological shift from thinking that higher ed is a public good to a private good, and how many young people are just basically opting out for lots of reasons, but cost being a big driver, right? And so at some point, either they or their progeny are gonna come back, and we're gonna be in the same place that we're in now. Like, it's not ever going to end, right? We're not ever going to, but I think even if we're not having these kind of conversations, then the challenges will be just that much more grim, right? Because we'll have so many more folks by the time students, young people buy back into higher ed, and by the time we recover from the enrollment cliff, right? I mean, I just kind of see some the my little ball is saying that things are not going to get, things will be harder before they get easier, right? So
Right, right.
yeah. So Jen, what kinds of services and programs help students navigate these challenges?
Yeah, so I think basic needs is a good place to start, right? So you mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So if we want students to get to that pinnacle point of, true self realization, right? So if we put it in higher ed context, right? So this would be the student who has learns in the classroom, but also learns outside of the classroom and is having, these experiences and encounters that allow them to grow and stretch and develop into a learned individual who's also a good citizen, right? If we want students to be able to do that, then their basic needs have to be met. So they have to have food, they have to feel secure, they have to have shelter, they have to have their needs being met. And connecting them to those resources is really important. But basic needs, right? So lots of campuses have food pantries. They have rideshare programs, right? They also have like relationships with Lyft and Uber and stuff, right? To discount use. Um, uh, Loaner programs like laptop loaner programs or like lending libraries or like repurposing things. I've seen this
Yeah.
growing, right? So, and this, look, I'm learning a whole new world here and I
Yeah.
love it because this is great. But there are a lot of institutions that are like, trying to save the environment, but also helping students get connected with what they need. And so, students move out and they leave things or donate things, and then they're fixed up or cleaned up, made sure they're good, and then repurposed. It could be sold, it could be just borrow, just have, right? So basic needs, right? So students can function. And then high impact practices, students need to be able to have almost to have the opportunity to engage in all that a university or an institution has, right? So I'll use education abroad as an example. And I was talking about this with someone earlier, a couple de decades ago when I was in undergrad. I wasn't able to study abroad because um, you had to pay your tuition and you had to pay for the overseas experience. And I'm like, I'm just trying to pay the tuition, right? How am I going to double that? That's insane. So I let that go. And that was, it was a misfortune in a sense. Like
Yeah.
I know it's a great experience when one is able to do it. But there are programs now where your financial aid goes towards the cost, right? So, and I think that students don't really know this. And so if students don't have this working knowledge of how to maximize the resources that they are aware of them having, like their financial aid and their tuition dollars and wherever they are getting some financial support, then they're going to self-select out of these opportunities, right? And so we need to help students to connect to these high impact practices, extracurricular, however you want to phrase it, so that they can expand themselves and, build their resume, right? So they can have these experiences that folks want them to have when they're looking to hire them or admit them to their graduate program, right? Um, or their internship or, whatever it might be. And so we have to make sure that students are getting connected to these resources, also known as opportunities, however that looks.
It's really about connecting. Those services are really about helping, refer students to what they need and how to get it, right?
Right.
So as you know, our students are professional students. They're in a graduate program, and you know, in the last few years, our schools have really emphasized kind of this particular type of identity and recognizing that there does seem to be still something happening, right? Because I think that we all get to this place where it's like, okay, well, undergrad is done, so you got it, good. Like, leave us alone, right? Um, but what are your thoughts around the, I guess, persistent first gen challenges that we may also see in, graduate and professional education?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back again to my sociological roots. And if we think about every location is a social location and it has a culture of itself. So just like we talk about hidden curriculum, and we do use it mostly around undergrad because there's a lot more undergrads than
Yeah,
grad and professional, right? But there is a hidden curriculum there, but there is a curriculum, there's a culture there, but there is also a culture to graduate school, right?
yeah,
And and we can't assume that they're the same. There are some transferable expectations, but they're not the same.
yeah,
Okay. And my parents both went to undergrad and both had master's degrees. And then I entered a doctoral program right after undergrad, and I was not successful at that time. And I saw where I got to a point where my parents could not answer questions for me. They did not have knowledge of navigating a doctoral program or doing a graduate program as a resident, because they both had worked at various times while working on their master's degrees and were older. I went straight through, right? So there were different experiences that they weren't able to share with me. And so if we think about a person being first in family to go to college, undergrad, they complete that. One, we can't assume that they weren't surviving. And we want them to thrive. We do. But that's not always the case. And that's what we're working toward. And so they've gotten through undergrad. And then if they decide to go to a graduate or professional school, and they were first in their family to go to an undergraduate program, well, now they're first to do
Yeah.
something else, right? Just like they could, if they didn't go straight to a graduate professional program and they go into the career world, well, they may be the first in their family to have a different kind of career and have to learn the culture of that, right? So I had to learn what it was like to not be a graduate student, but to be a higher education professional. And there were things to learn. I look back at some old emails I wrote. Oh my goodness. And I was like, who was this person? It was someone who didn't know the culture of the workplace just yet, right? And so how does that read to people when you show up as a graduate or a professional student and you're not doing the things that that space expects for you to do? And so I'll go back to what we were talking about with policies and practices, right? So you said it. Well, I went through that and it was that way. And so that is classic, unfortunately, in a lot of graduate program, professional programs, is that it has got to be hard, it's got to be grueling, you have to be uncomfortable, you have to be miserable, and then we'll call you Dr. So-and-so, right? And so if we think about changing what our responsibility is to change some of that culture and to make the experience different, I think it will make way for a different experience for folks who are first in family to go to graduate or professional school.
Yeah, yeah. And thanks so much for even kind of extending that to the workplace, because I had a question about that, and it does show up there. I think that the other thing that I want to note is that the hidden curriculum is certainly important all the way through, but for those first gen folks in graduate and professional programs, it's almost even more critical because they don't have a model at home or that community that they may have originated from, right? And so they're trying to look around. Okay, well, this is the way, this is what the culture of this institution and the hidden curriculum of the institution tells me. Look, this is what success looks like, right? And like, help us all if it is the most toxic faculty member that you got. And let's not act like we don't have them, right? So, right. But that really can result in, ultimately these folks are entering professions, they're entering workplaces, all of these things. And all of that, just those experiences come with them, right? Those experiences come with them. There's another question that we saw here, and that is, how does issues around disability and accommodations kind of fit into this as well? As an aside, we are really interested at AAVMC. I'm looking to do a lot of work around disableism and kind of thinking about how can we change the paradigm of our thinking that it should be this way, when if we set the bar differently, increased access, it becomes a very broad outcome. So, how does, folks who have varying levels of physical, emotional, mental ability, how does that fit into here too?
Right. Great question. Where I go first is thinking about creating a truly equitable society. And I'm referring to institutions as
Sure,
mini
sure.
societies. You want to aim to support the person in the room who has the greatest need, or most critical needs. And so if we start there, there is no harm done to everybody else.
Right.
Okay. But if we flip that and start thinking about other folks who we think have the least amount of need and can just do the things, and we create systems that like
Yeah.
exist now for
Yeah.
that, right?
Right.
Then we're doing a lot of harm to other
Yeah.
folks, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a place to begin, is really and it takes having folks who have different abilities and um, different perspectives, identities, intersectionalities to be at the table, to either be asked for their opinion or to be the folks who are in the room because we've hired them, because, we want them on our teams and there's space for them so that they can then create for others the experiences that they didn't have. You know what I mean? And I think that's so critical.
Yeah. And so and to add to that, and I know we had a podcast 2 weeks ago. I just want to go ahead and warn everybody that I'm going to say this at many, many, many podcasts this year. And that is we have to think about resiliency very differently, right? Because oftentimes I hear things like, oh, well, are these folks going to be resilient when they hit the real world? And I was like, their world has been real the entire time. Let's go back to remember when your real world started, right? And you'll find that it's started way earlier than we like to admit, right? Like it started day one. And so, this idea that these students need to toughen up and figure it out is, again, we say that from a place of privilege where we've been through it and we survived. We might not have thrived. We might be thriving now, but again, it's decades later. And I've gotten to this place, Jen, where I'm somewhat offended by this notion that this is literally a stomping ground to learn resilience. And I'm like, what makes you think that this person who is the first to do this isn't resilient? Like they've beaten the odds to get here, right? And so, I really continue to challenge us to think about resiliency and how we um, develop it very differently, right? And it also gets to your point of like how many of these programs are hard because of the institutional culture and this notion that it should be hard because you earned it versus like what does it look like for us to have a thriving educational experience that tries first to do no harm, right? Which is also a medical principle, people, for a medical curriculum. First, do no harm, right? And so, this idea that we're trying to get folks to toughen up is for me gaslighting at its worst in some ways. And so, one last question after I'm climbing down off my soapbox now. One last question, and that is so for institutions and employers, since we know that some of these behaviors continue to linger for lots of different reasons and emerge in the workplace, what guidance do you have for us in terms of not only kind of trying to get our arms around how to talk about what the first gen experience actually is and looks like, and how do we meet some of those needs?
So, what I'm thinking about a couple things. So, one, I think we have to think about our intentionality, and I know I've said that a lot. Um, but I think we have a real opportunity here. And so hopefully we take it to do things different, to change things because situations, demographics, all kinds of things are causing us to do that. So I think it's about what is your purpose and your aim with the action that you're taking or the non-action that you're taking. I also think that it may sound kind of hokey, but I think we should remember who we were as students and what would we have wanted or needed in a moment in an era of our time that would have made the experience we had better or different, right? I think about that a lot as I teach. And when students send me emails and they're telling me, like, you can miss up to a certain number of classes, but they're like, hey, I'm going to be absent. And I'm like, okay. But then I'm like, well, I'm going to respond because 20 something years ago, I would have wanted a professor to respond to me because it would have just been acknowledging, right? And yes, and bring that anxiety down. And so that's something that I really had to think about is, whoa, I'm in a classroom full of me's. And so how would I have wanted some faculty to have interacted with me or higher ed professionals or whomever that maybe they didn't, right? We are those people
Yeah.
and we have that responsibility. So I think, we have to really consider that. And I'll go back to last thing is the data, right? I know I keep talking about, and look, I'm not a
Data. We love data.
quantitative person. So qualitative data is important too. Focus groups and interviews and asking students, and also looking for the research that's out there that is asking students that are similar to your priority populations, what are their needs? What are they telling you? And then we actually hear what they're saying. And then we use the privilege and the power that we have in the seats that we sit in to do something different. And that takes a lot because I know there are a lot of different pulling entities in different directions. But again, I'll go back to intentionality, and thinking about why we're doing the things that we're doing and who's potentially going to be harmed or helped.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Just want to shout out Elizabeth Lowinger. She was talking about she's at University of Guelph in Canada and talking about, helping with supplies and donation of scrubs and boots and all of those things to the incoming class. And we see a lot of that at the schools. A number of the schools have lending programs. They have all kinds of things to try to meet some of those needs. And so, there is a kind of baseline at a number of our schools to kind of get at some of this, but I do think that we need to think about it a bit more holistically. And it dawns on me, and I know some folks may have heard me talk about, again, me and my daughter, but I remember, and this should have, I was really excited that day. I had defended and I was really excited. We were going to dinner. I had defended my dissertation, was like, yeah, it's great. And this should have been my like ding, my daughter is going to have a different kind of experience because that evening, and it was so crazy, but that evening, my daughter was like, I'm so proud of you, mom. It's great. We were a very, very new family at that time, about like not even quite 6 months old. And she said, so you're a doctor? Yes. Okay. So what are you a doctor of? And I was like, well, education. She was like, huh, education. So like schools. And I was like, for the purpose of this conversation, sure, doctor of schools. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. And I was like, yes, like I just spent like $80,000 and my daughter dragged me the day of my dissertation, right? But clearly I had not made the impression. And again, it was so early on, but it also, now that I reflect on that, and I've told that story a number of times, but I reflect on it right now and I'm like, oh wow, that was a clue that
Right,
went over
right.
my head, that this idea of
Mhm,
education as a thing unto itself,
mhm.
as a body, of literature of study, right? A thing of study, like it hadn't even occurred to her, much less like where to go, what to do, any of that stuff. But we
Exactly.
talk about that a lot now. It was just the humbling experience that a new recently passed her dissertation really needed to have to bring the balloon right on down, right before the champagne came to the table. So kids will do nothing if not humble you, right? So
Exactly. Exactly.
well, Jen, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. I really appreciate it. And I also just have to say that I'm just so proud of you. And I've been really watching your career for a number of years. And I'm just really, really proud of the work that you're doing and the folks that you're reaching. And so, thank you so much for giving little old me an hour of your time today to talk about, just how important it is for us to think about these types of experiences that students are having. So,
Yeah,
thank you.
absolutely. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate all of your consistent support.
Yeah. Thanks. So this has been another episode of AAVMC's Diversity and Inclusion on Air. Be sure to check out our show, of course, on YouTube if you want to see our lovely faces, or you can listen to us on your favorite podcast app. We are on all of them. So be sure to check out the programming that we will be putting out in the next few months. Again, we'll be looking definitely at some issues around ableism. We'll be looking at things like gender affirming care and vet med, and a whole host of other topics. So we will see you next time, and thanks so much.